All right, and so with that, we have our first session, and we have a really awesome speaker coming to us from AFWERX, Colonel Nathan Diller, who's the director at AFWERX. This session is focused on secure autonomy. That's obviously going to be a big theme for today's track, as you heard from Dr. McNeil. These autonomous systems that can help improve and increase in efficiency. That's something that Colonel Diller is going to be talking about here. I don't know if you folks are not familiar with AFWERX. I would highly recommend that you look into it. I know so many of our startups have found opportunities to work with them through their SBIR program. And so this is a really great way for startups to get engaged with the government and work within that ecosystem. And there's lots of funding opportunities through the Small Business Innovation Research Grant program. So Colonel Diller is going to talk to us a little bit about that. And we'll have him up here in just a second. And so while we get his video up, let's see, Colonel Diller, I think we've got him with us. And so let's go ahead and bring up to the stage Colonel Nathan Diller. Nate, welcome.
Hey, thanks so much, Sean, and thanks to Capital Factory. I had the chance to visit there just a couple months ago. Great to get back to my home state of Texas, and really exciting to see the amazing work that's happening there in the Austin area. Great partnership that we have with Capital Factory there. We have our AFWERX location there at Capital Factory, super presence there. As Sean said, if you haven't had a chance, obviously a little more complicated in COVID times, but we certainly welcome you to stop by and see the super team that we have there going across our active duty. We've got our reservist and really great partnership as well with the Texas Guard. They've been great hosts. We actually had the chance, and it ties a little bit into the discussion today with autonomy, to not only see some of the great startups that have taken advantage of our SBIR process. I'll talk a little bit to that because I think it's important and actually relevant to this autonomy space, the secure autonomy space. So I'll talk a little bit to that, but getting to see some of the companies there in and around the Austin area. Also had the opportunity to see a demonstration by a local company there in Austin as well for one of our programs that we call Agility Prime. So what I'd like to do is really launch into this idea of autonomy and secure autonomy. It's really, what an exciting time that we're living in right now, where we're beginning to see kind of this revolution in so many different areas, and one that I think is really being fueled by the ecosystem that's being developed with the startup community. And hopefully we, as part of AFWERX, can be a good partner in that community. So I'm going to give just a little bit of an introduction to AFWERX. I want to dive deeply into autonomy. Again, certainly not going to claim to be an expert, but I want to at least give a little bit of insight into how some of our interest in autonomy and some of the things that we are hoping that we can do in collaboration with those of you out there working in this space in a way that will allow us to move towards autonomy quickly, but as Sean said, is critical that it's being done in a safe and a secure manner. So we'll talk a bit through that autonomy, talk specifically to some of the benefits that we see, and then talk a little bit, how are we getting there with AFWERX, some of the specific things that we're doing, and then finish up a bit with a case study and with our program Agility Prime in more detail there. So just quickly, so I am the director of AFWERX. AFWERX is kind of this experiment that was started a couple of years ago. When we were looking around, we were starting to realize that here in the United States, we're at the point where only about 20% of the overall research and development for our country is being done by the Department of Defense. And so if we want to try to get to some of these fantastic new technologies that so many of you are developing out there, what are the ways that we can become better partners? And so that started an experiment called AFWERX. And we did that for a couple of years. We launched the location there in Austin at Capital Factory, and a couple of other similar, we'll call them startup innovation efforts internal to the Department of Defense. One of those was AF Ventures, and one of those was also Agility Prime. And then about May, the Air Force leadership said, we've done several different experiments into this innovation space. Some of them have actually started to look very promising. What is it that we can do to institutionalize some of this work in a way that ensures long-term we have the ability to maintain this innovative culture, in particular, some of these innovative processes. And so what you had is AFWERX, who's really great at reaching out, creating connectivity across our airmen. We had AFVentures reaching out to the different startup communities out there, and then this Agility Prime idea. And that if we look into the future for our Department of the Air Force, and we look to the vast capabilities that we think we need to get to, potentially a broader set of capabilities, ones that have much faster refresh time, ones that are leveraging this commercial capability, ones that are really coming from some of the most innovative places in the world out there today. How do we get to that capability? And so the idea largely in this new capability development construct is taking a little bit of a different look. So I, in the Air Force, after finished up the Air Force Academy, went to fly fighters for a few years. From there, went on to be a test pilot through the French Test Pilot School. Did some program management at Space and Missile Center, particularly did some work with GPS. Came back and did some additional flight test work in command, and then came into the Pentagon doing requirements work, capability development work. And in that process, typically what we have done is we've gone to the warfighter and said, how is it that you want to fight the war in the future? What are the technologies that you'd like to have? And then we we write requirements for those technologies. We publish those requirements out. We look for the companies in our defense industrial base and see which of those companies are actually able to go and meet that set of requirements. What we've looked at is we look into the future. We look at the potential of austere budgets in the future. We look at the speed that technology is changing. We're looking to potentially a different paradigm, and one that requires us to think differently about that capability development paradigm, and one where are there ways that we can expand that industrial base to get us a broader set of talent. So expanding the technology, expanding the talent by connecting our airmen that understand the needs right out there on the front lines. How do we bring that talent and that understanding of the gaps closer into that capability development? And then lastly, you might have heard of this idea of the valley of death, that where you have super technology, you've got a super talent that has brought together concepts of how to use that technology. Then you have some really hard things. And we talk about it when we're doing acquisition. In the Department of Defense, it's some of the most serious work that we do from the perspective that we are being charged with the responsibility, one, of taking the treasure of the taxpayer, and two, using the treasure of the taxpayer in a way that creates an ability to protect our nation and to protect the members, our service members who are protecting that nation. So pretty serious business that we're in there. And as a result, we have developed a series of checks and balances, both that help ensure that the treasure of the taxpayer is used properly, and that ensure that the capabilities that go out are effective against our adversaries and are effective in providing protections, right, survivability for our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and our Space Force professionals. The challenge with all of that is many of those checks and balances, as you might know, have become a bit bureaucratic, and in cases have not necessarily allowed for the passage of those great technologies, coupled with the talent to use those technologies across this thing that we call the valley of death, the point where we actually are fielding those capabilities. And so this last piece of AFWERX is looking at those transitions. So that technology, talent, and transitions using AFVentures, using this new idea of Spark for our airmen, and using Prime, specifically the first of those Agility Prime. And so I'll talk to that in more detail. So that's a little bit of a background of where we have recently come with AFWERX. And I want to transition now a little bit into the exciting realm of autonomy and the importance of ensuring that autonomy is secure. When you think about the potential benefits, absolutely profound. It's also, a very interesting subject in that as we start thinking about autonomy, you get to some very basic questions of what does it mean, where does a human belong? What are the tasks that are uniquely human tasks? What types of tasks are better suited potentially for robots for autonomy? Some of those mundane tasks, when we think about flying, for example, where are there cases that those repetitive tasks that are very, we often, when I was going through pilot training, kind of part our rote memorization, are there other cases where, that is a place to put a machine on, there's other places not to. But as discussed at the beginning, if this is not something that is approached with a sense that either with, nefarious causes or just different anomalies, how do we make sure that there is trust in autonomy? And what does it look like from this trust and autonomy? And how do we start to develop the rules that ensure that we can trust this autonomy and that this autonomy is safe and secure? A few different themes that I want to talk through. So the first, this idea of trust and assurance, potentially when under attack, or as I mentioned, in response to some of these unintentional interferences. The second theme, looking and understanding how to mitigate some of the vulnerabilities inherent in these autonomous systems. Third point, how can safety and security help ensure that not only it's obviously paramount to the DoD, but how can we, with organizations like AFWERX, help kind of incubate this level of security, not only for the DoD, but creating a safer critical infrastructure as we begin moving these autonomous systems beyond just the Department of Defense, or in some cases when the Department of Defense is bringing them in. What can we do to make sure that is secure across our systems, both domestic, commercial, with public use cases and with military use cases? The fourth theme, making sure that we have clearly established standards, some of the delineation of responsibilities to make sure that we really are successful in deploying these autonomous systems in society. The fifth point I want to talk to is autonomy and the priority that it is to the DoD, not only for strategic advantage, but to help make it a more affordable force. As I mentioned, when we look to the future and some of the potential budgets that we have lying ahead, we have a responsibility to look, it's not just an opportunity, it really is a responsibility to look at these new technologies and see what can be done, again, to help save taxpayer dollars and to drive greater effectiveness and survivability for our operators. And the last point I'll touch on with the secure autonomy is how can we work collaboratively with industry? And it'll be a bit of a transition back to some of the case studies that we have and how I feel, and we in AFWERX are working towards a future where we are very much hand in hand with the startup folks, looking also to some of our larger industry. Obviously, there's significant investment happening by major businesses around the country, as well as by DoD, and looking also the importance of that relationship with our interagency partners. We've really had some phenomenal work in collaboration with FAA and NASA. How do we continue to build on that, to include actually DoD, Department of Energy as well? So this first theme, how do we integrate the various autonomous systems and make sure that there's trust and assurance that they're going to do what they're supposed to do, even when they're under attack, or potentially when there's something like a network outage? So what type of protections need to be baked in, and how do we start to think about this from the outset? And there's some very interesting approaches when we're thinking about initial architecture to create those proper failure modes that have to be built in right from the beginning, have to be built in to the software with the idea that there will be either cyber attacks, that there will be, when we have dependencies on potentially distributed sources of information that help augment that autonomy. How do we recognize when there's intentional or unintentional failures for things like navigation, communication sensors, some of the mechanical failures? Making sure that if there is a vulnerability, understanding what those fallback modes are and making sure that we are, always aware that, there's measures and countermeasures, and that game of cat and mouse will continue to be played moving forward. As we're doing that, we are in the process of in several of our programs thinking about how we can become more collaborative with industry to share some of the hard lessons learned that we have certainly taken time and resources from the taxpayer as we begin understanding these. On that second theme, what are the inherent vulnerabilities and what are the different sources of those? So we look at some of the supply chains that are out there. What are ways that we can begin to shore up those supply chains? This is a great point of collaboration that we've had with NASA just recently, in particular with folks at NASA Ames. How do we start thinking about those supply chains differently, making sure that we understand at the core when we're looking at the cases where very limited numbers of a particularly critical component. How do we start building that out? How do we start to identify those sources? As we're beginning to get more dependent on those autonomous systems, as we look at logistics networks, how do we make sure that there's cybersecurity verification, validation throughout that? As we're looking at machine learning and potential use of that, how do we make sure that we understand, part of this is where is, going back to the initial point, where does the human need to be in the loop? What are the cases where you can create some independence among those autonomous systems so that you have, to some degree, an independent checks and balances among independent autonomous systems, or clearly among independent humans that are potentially, that human on the loop or human that's starting the loop, hopefully being that human that, if necessary, can also stop the loop. If there is widespread adoption, what are the types of perception, cognition systems, and what do you do in terms of being able to identify the potential weaknesses of those, and being able to, knowing that you could have hundreds of players in an autonomous ecosystem, what does that do if there's a security breach and those are all 100% interwoven and dependent on one another? So how do we ensure that there is an ability to sever that interdependence when you begin to see, one, can you recognize that nefarious activity? Two, how do you begin to isolate it into those specific areas? When we look at some of the microelectronics, again, at the very core, how do we identify where they've come from and start to build trust in the development of those microelectronics, both from a hardware and a software perspective? On this third theme, looking, the idea that safety is going to help assure some of the commercial stability in the marketplace. So it's an important conversation as we look into this new era of autonomous systems going into our cities. I'll talk specifically here in a moment about the idea of flying through our national airspace with an increased amount of autonomy. How do we start to build trust on that? If there is a network outage, how do we make sure that there's, not such a strong dependence on that you're able to go to those different failure modes? And there's been some recent cases of that you're probably familiar with, more on the ground vehicle side. If we look at a fully autonomous vehicle, moving at high speed, either in the air or on land, and there's a network failure, what do you do to mitigate that failure? As you look to, and there's some exciting work happening actually there in and around Austin, thinking about what this future network looks like. What does it look like to deploy the necessary autonomous infrastructure? Where you have computing on the edge, where you have sensors on the edge, where you have communication on the edge. As you're doing that, huge potential of creating higher levels of autonomy in those autonomous systems, being able to build a higher level of trust by using the information that's coming from, that's not part of ownership. So as we're starting to think about that, how do we ensure that when that autonomy infrastructure potentially fails, what are those ownership capabilities of the individual vehicles and the autonomous systems on those vehicles that can self-diagnose, recognizing where with the proper checks and balances with those off-board sensors or communication. As we're doing that, how do we make sure, again, that we have a secure version of autonomy for air and land-based systems, and doing that in a way that ensures both, again, from a military perspective, it ensures an accelerated path through the collaboration. Part of that comes through this fourth theme on standards and some of the responsibility. And this obviously, gets into more complex issues as we start to look at the law that gets built up around our future autonomous systems. Developing safety standards for assurance of autonomy in the way that we've done with some of our traditional ground and general aviation. When we do this, are there places, again, where some of the dual use capabilities from the military and from the civil market could be more effectively leveraged with collaborative investment? Creating some type of what do the standards look like for interoperability, so that you can quickly increase the complexity of the operations as you're moving forward. At the same time, what are the rules and who's responsible when operating the systems in society? So again, a lot of very interesting ethical questions, philosophical questions on these, but very quickly, as we've again already seen in many cases in ground autonomy, these are issues that are very much, they're here and now, and they require, I think, ongoing thought. And it's a body of knowledge that really requires a very multidisciplinary group of stakeholders to come together across industry, across the government, in many cases across some of the nonprofits that are out there, and doing that in a way that's open, collaborative, that's mindful of safety and security, that's mindful in some cases of privacy, and certainly that is mindful of still being able to move forward, right? If this potentially is a future that we never see if we're not able to take risk, and this is another point I want to talk to you a bit at the end with AFWERX. How are we able potentially to mitigate some of those risks earlier? As we look at some of the examples, if you lose communication with an autonomous aircraft that's on a flight plan, what is a ground control response to that? How's that communicated to air traffic control? How does it affect other operations in the area? How is that burden shared? And if that actually happens, where are the backup systems in order to identify the type of emergency situations that right now we build into our pilot systems? How do we make a transition potentially? Taking in some cases, what the most difficult part of this is not the traditional stick and rudder skills, if I'm speaking in the aircraft terminology for this, but more those judgment skills. On this fifth theme, what is driving the U.S. government's application of autonomy? When in 2011, the Secretary of Defense designated autonomy as one of 7 priority S&T investments. Looking across our future POM, it continues to gain traction across a variety of our strategic documents, not only the Department of Defense, but more broadly across whole of government. We had a roadmap that was put together looking back to 2017, highlighting the importance of autonomy to our overall efficiency and effectiveness from both manned and unmanned systems, and something that long-term provides us strategic advantage, not only in the capabilities, but also in the fact that there's the potential for cost savings. We can think of some of the most exquisite cases to some of the more mundane. Are there ways that we can potentially leverage those near-term mundane activities, gaining some ability to provide cost savings to the taxpayer while developing knowledge and understanding for some of the more exquisite capabilities? as we look back, back into 2018, the National Defense Strategy specifically called out autonomy as a technology that helps us win and fight future wars. Looking, also artificial intelligence, machine learning, and rapidly applying those commercial breakthroughs to gain a competitive advantage. And it's that particular idea that really has gained traction in our approach internal to AFWERX. As we're going into the FY21 defense budget planning, again, Autonomy, advanced capability enabler, $1.7 billion to enhance the speed of maneuver and lethality in the contested environments, with ideas about developing human-machine teaming. What does that look like in the future, and how do we take some of the near-term steps in that? And then when we looked at this year's presidential research and development priorities in August, specifically directing prioritization of research in autonomous, with a focus on transportation in particular. Also looking to see how direct research and development in technologies can be leveraged for near-term safety and security in some of our transportation systems. So this is certainly in DoD an opportunity where we see near-term, and not just opportunity, but really a mandate to move forward and move forward in a meaningful way. So this last piece, and this will be a bit of a transition from this sixth theme here, is focused on industry partnership. And so as the director of AFWERX, really excited to be talking with all the entrepreneurs here, the innovators that are out there in this space, looking for opportunities where we can foster a culture that really enables these transformative opportunities sooner than many might realize is possible. Within AFWERX, we've got Prime, and I'll dig into this a little bit more with the first pathfinder that is Agility Prime. But really, we are taking a very deliberate effort to see how particular industries like autonomy can be advanced quickly with this collaborative, I'll call it risk sharing, as well as opportunity sharing in this space. And how do we do that with the commercial markets in a way that we, so far we found a lot of promise in our program called Agility Prime. We don't necessarily want to duplicate internal to the Department of Defense the things that are happening in industry. How together can we leverage what's happening in industry, de-risk what's happening in industry to be able to move forward at a faster pace. And as we do that, trying to avoid, re-engineering the things that are already happening out there. The Air Force Research Lab has done some fantastic work. DARPA obviously has always been a pioneer in some of these breakthrough capabilities. So really looking over to some of your inputs and how you do this, just as a brief, as a brief case study. So we launched this program, Agility Prime, back in the spring. And the idea on this is, how do we look at what has kind of been seen as a third revolution in aerospace? If you look back, first revolution looking at reciprocating engines, wood and fabric materials, and in particular, as it's, for today's point, how was control done? It was done with kind of the mechanical controls that you saw for years, and there's still many aircraft doing that. So we went into the second age. You get jet propulsion, you get new potential for a lot of aluminum use. And now we think about controls, we get into hydraulic actuators, we get into eventually the electric jet, where you're seeing kind of some of the early trust in the computer and how that augmented capability can help. We're now on this cusp of this, what is being referred to as a third age, of a third revolution in aerospace. Again, with, in this case, electric propulsion, some of the advanced materials in manufacturing, and for us today, the huge value that could come from autonomy, and the, for society, the ability really to, in the future, democratize air travel in a way that we haven't seen before. And so that program with Agility Prime, taking this new electric vertical takeoff and landing market and seeing how we, as AFWERX, internal to Agility Prime, can begin to reduce some of the technical challenges. So bringing these vehicles onto our bases where we can go do a lot of testing in austere locations, right? While we did get a chance to fly just a few miles from downtown Austin with a company there in the area a few months ago, a lot of that testing we can do in very austere locations. How can we de-risk the regulatory challenges? This is where there's been really fantastic collaboration with the FAA and with NASA to be able to use some of that near-term testing for us in the military, but being able to share that data with FAA to develop a level of trust. And while we're doing that, we're not only de-risking the regulatory by generating data, but also ideally de-risking this technology and autonomy financially and generating some revenue. How do we think about some of the infrastructure risks? Can we start to look at that autonomous infrastructure? Can we start to let society see what we are doing and the trust that we are slowly developing to begin to make some of those cultural ties so that there is that trust and autonomy? The supply chain work that I mentioned that we're doing with NASA. And I think this last one that is extremely important is, what does that future workforce look like? How are we bringing the workforce of the future to understand the importance where you have kind of this coalescence of software and hardware coming together in ways that we haven't seen before? I think that's largely what is driving this third revolution in aerospace. So we have in Agility Prime received over 335 applications for our small business technology transfer program, reaching out to universities across the country. We'll be announcing those in the next few weeks, and really, I think, taking that most important risk, and that's the humans, understanding where those humans belong in the future, understanding how those humans are developing those secure autonomous systems, and ideally understanding how we as humans can work together across the startup community, across industry, across academia, and across us here in government, in particular, us here in AFWERX, to do that. So looking forward to that partnership. Sean, thanks for the time, and looking forward to any questions or feedback that folks have out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for laying it all out there and helping us understand what are the kind of left and right parameters. We have actually a couple of questions from the audience, and then I also have a few questions from my just from what you've talked about. So the first question that we have is from Jack Elston, who asked, and it goes to what you were talking about there with the FAA, but with the push towards open source autopilots, particularly small unmanned aircraft systems, how do you maintain a strong level of security when the exact expected behaviors and details of the communications and control interfaces are exposed to anyone?
Sure. So this is, I think there's questions to some degree, one on testing, one on failure modes. We spent a lot of time thinking about different approaches to anti-tamper. Are there ways that, in some of the cases, you might look at that for embedded systems? What is that degree of knowledge that is there? We see this today. We have series of critical infrastructure capabilities where the inner workings of that are certainly there and available. And this is I think something that's not necessarily just specific to autonomy in the future. It is something that we in the Department of Defense have spent many years and significant amount of funding. In the end, are you going to be able to protect against everything? And so the thought that you're going to be able to just harden 100% from a cyber perspective, it requires an entire system. And I think that's where we start to think about the infrastructure that's necessary. How do you start to recognize those anomalies quickly? How do you create those failure modes? How do you create interdependencies? And then in the end, how do you keep a human in the loop? So we've got a series of test organizations that have become very engaged in cyber, embedded hardening of some of our cyber systems. I think there's some lessons learned that we can potentially start to push out. We have, NIST standards that have, I think, done a lot to help create that assurance in the systems that we have right now. But I think, again, that ongoing collaboration and some capabilities that, again, we might get to faster in the commercial sector. How do we incorporate those in collaboratively from a security and safety as well?
Yeah. So you mentioned, is it NIST, N-I-S-T?
Correct.
I'm curious, just as a layperson, who governs like the the I guess what the protocols are, or the regulations around like autonomous vehicles. Like, is there an FAA for cars that are driving on roads autonomously?
Oh, well, so I think, as we look across, certainly Department of Transportation, and I think it becomes a little bit more complicated here in the United States of America, as we look across. Complicated, but there's some interesting things too as we start to look across. This idea of our states and our states to some degree being different ways of testing. You in a lot of cases you have state and local entities that have a significant amount of control of that, both from a ground system perspective, as well as in some cases from an air system perspective. And so how do you leverage that? What's the balance of creating a national standard on some of these? What is the balance of being able to give some autonomy at the state and local standards? So, one of the things that we did with the drone work is the IPP that was established. So how do we go create these small test areas? And we have, to some degree, different rules in those areas, getting exceptions from what would be a national standard that, in many cases is governed by multiple different agencies at the state and local level, as well as at the federal level. So I think, it depends on the type of autonomous system. You can imagine some of the autonomous systems for critical infrastructure, less in the world of autonomous mobility. How do we, across those different segments, again, build trust and build security in a way that's effective? And I think there is a lot of value in having kind of a state system where there's opportunity to play in some areas. And I think with AFWERX, the way we see that as well, where do we create exceptions to go take some of those higher risk areas, higher risk, where you can accept a, in case of its loss of system, you're putting in an austere location. So, to some degree, you have the DoD acting, as its own country to some degree. You have different states that have done the same. You have some of these IPPs that have also created these sandboxes. And I think creating these sandboxes is critical, so that you can't necessarily develop the standards. In some cases, you don't necessarily know the vulnerabilities to establish what may eventually be this global, or this national standard until you establish those sandboxes.
So you talk about those sandbox environments, and I think you've done a great job of outlining, like, these, I would assume you're talking about Air Force bases. You mentioned Texas Military Department. Is this something where through AFWERX, if I'm a startup, I can say, hey, I have this really cool technology, want to try it out? Is there really a way to get into one of these environments and work directly with you guys to test out new technologies?
Yeah, absolutely. So if anyone interested in this in particular, if you go to agilityprime.com, that is our use case where we've, again, we're using that a bit as a first of what we would expect to be multiple prime programs. And so as you go there, we've laid out an approach, we call it the air race to certification, where if you meet certain criteria, and again, you can find this on agilityprime.com, if you go to air race, we lay out the documents there. And basically what it is it's an application process. What we're looking for is, are there ways where we can de-risk, primarily from a technology, regulatory, and financial perspective? You apply to, we have 3 different areas of interest. And so again, these areas of interest align to different form factors associated with these electric vertical takeoff, eVTOL, these flying cars, these orbs. So you can apply to these different areas of interest. It's kind of a 3-step process. The first process is to some degree a paperwork drill. We like to see that, there's real engineering that's happening there. You have a real commercial market. You've got a business that can bring forward this commercial market, or bring forward this capability into a commercial market with some investors. If that goes well, and there's what we see as capability, we then do a site survey, looking at, what does it look like to eventually start manufacturing? What does the timeline look like? If you're doing flight tests, what's the progress of the flight test? And then that third phase is part of that. The second phase discussion is, where can we do collaborative work? And so We then, in the third phase, go write, in some case, these no-cost contracts, where it's giving opportunity to companies to, in a case of our flying orbs, being able to do ground vibration testing to understand the very complex nature associated with distributed electric propulsion, going and doing wind tunnel testing. So providing opportunity for those companies that can get into our wind tunnels at no cost. Climate labs, being able to see what it looks like, specifically doing some of the cyber hardening, which we've addressed today. So that's something we've laid out. We have several companies that are in that process right now. For us, it's, in theory, we're getting some really great data that helps us overall accelerate this market and bring this technology to the field, not only for DoD, but for the commercial sector, because in the long run, we see ourselves, ideally being some of the early adopters to help accelerate the capability by leveraging, a lot of the assets that the taxpayers have invested in order to do, the decades of work that we've done with new flying things. Can we provide that back to industry and then really provide that capability back to the taxpayer by maintaining a very strong U.S. aerospace defense sector that, in theory, eventually, as we've said, this democratization of air travel to connect people at a lower cost with more agility. So it's there, available now. We're looking to do that in other sectors, starting to kind of take feedback, from the success that we've seen so far in Agility Prime. What might it look like to launch some of the other prime programs in other sectors? Yeah,
that's really really interesting to see where things go from here. Have a couple questions from the audience, and you've given a couple of great examples. Do you have Brian Daniel, sorry, asked if you could have real world examples of the execution of your goals through that Agility Prime program or just through AFWERX writ large? Do you have any success stories in autonomous systems that you guys have helped leverage?
So with the autonomous systems, we, with Agility Prime, we've been focused primarily on the air vehicle. We certainly understand the need to do that in the near term. With AFWERX, still looking to see in the commercial sector what that looks like. What you have seen, so AFWERX recently became part of AFRL, and if you start to look across AFRL with some of the things that we're doing with manned-unmanned teaming, you're seeing several of those, again, in some cases taking a bit more of a traditional DoD acquisition approach, but certainly some instances there with programs they've seen like our, thoughts on low-cost attritable, the Avatar program, Skyborg, Golden Horde, where we have, taken that model a bit. We'd like to do some further collaboration where we open that up a bit more to, and so we, there are a series of companies that are out there on small business contracts where we're starting to incubate this a bit, and that's where, we would like to start to leverage some of those companies that are on small business, the introductory contracts, that first phase one of, $50,000, phase two of $1 million. Then we start to grow that into some of our broader, what we call a Strat 5 program, where you're getting a more meaningful investment and co-investment. So I see that on the horizon. We've seen it, some advances internal to the Air Force Research Laboratory, and looking for near-term opportunities to do that.
Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned AFRL, for anyone not familiar, Air Force Research Lab. Obviously, you guys, AFWERX and AFRL are much more closely aligned now, but that's a really interesting aspect of the process of developing and, I think, kind of leveraging new technologies that come in. We have a question from Trevor Smith here, and honestly, I'm not sure what ABMS is. You may be more familiar. He asks, is AFWERX collaborating with non-traditional vendors on the ABMS program, and how do you envision secure autonomy as it relates to ABMS?
Sure. So we work closely with the teams on ABMS. We have had a lot of discussions of what it might look like to have closer collaboration with ABMS. They certainly have it's Advanced Battle Management System, for folks that are out there. So this is the idea of this advanced battle management system, to some degree, if you were to look at commercial technology, this might be what that, when I mentioned that autonomous infrastructure, right? It's the idea that I have those nodes on the edge that are providing sensors, communication, and computation on the edge, so that I don't necessarily have to have the same degree of ownership capabilities. So ABMS has had some fantastic, you look it up online, some fantastic results recently. The teams that are there are certainly looking to the commercial sector and realizing the huge benefit that our startups are doing. We've not formalized programs on that right now, but certainly similar veins there.
Yeah, I had to Google it while I got that question that came in, and it is not the American Board of Medical Service Providers, but it's interesting to know kind of the frameworks around these things. We're actually going to be talking. You mentioned vulnerability at the edge. We're going to be talking about that later today in another panel. That's definitely something that startups need to be focused on and thinking about. And actually, along those lines, compliance, I know, is really hard for startups because they do one thing and they do it really well. You've talked a little bit about ways that AFWERX is helping, bridge that gap from their commercial potential to actually, no kidding, being able to work with the Air Force. What are some of those, like you talked about infrastructures, you've talked about the funding mechanisms that y'all leverage, but what advice or guidance do you provide to the startups that once they get into the AFWERX process and they're on an SBIR, how do you guys help them, overcome some of those obstacles, some of those hurdles to really making sure that what they're putting together is something that you could get into the hands of the warfighter, get into the hands of the folks in the Air Force?
Yeah, sure. So I'll be honest, right? Some of this has come from learning because we've had a fantastically successful, I think, program with the AFWERX where we're taking these small business opportunities and getting them out and available. What we have found in some cases is you run into these hurdles. So being able to put new software on government systems, talking about security, that can be a huge challenge for, if it's something that flies, getting through an airworthiness, just getting through different types of contracting, getting through different types of certification. So we found this, sometimes it's just getting, what is the proper use of this? Finding the right operator that knows how to really provide value is potentially one of the most important things, because if you're going to create that market, you have to have that pool. And many times it's the operator being innovative and saying, hey, here's a really clever way of using this. So as we started to see those lessons learned, that's really been the genesis of this merging of AFWERX. When you put it together with Spark, AFWERX being able to touch, ideally reaching out and touching industry with rapid, accessible contracts that are available. Spark being able to have this network of airmen innovators thinking constantly about how to use that new technology. And then Prime, focused on the large prime, right, on agility prime. There's this concept that we're now really starting to dig into more of, this is creating capability to get across that valley of death. Let's make sure that we're building out that capability so that we have a more deliberate, we'll call them subprimes. So if it's not a deliberate prime, how do we create a capability to do exactly what was being asked there? Getting across on, to have the contract is one thing, to be able to go deliver the capability in the Air Force, there's a lot of hurdles that are still there. So we've really just over the last couple of months have been more deliberate on that. Some things that we're looking in terms of schedules for ventures. So what you'll see, looking towards December is what does a launch look like, making very clear to all the folks that are interested in playing, understanding that relationship and having some good baseline documentation and experience for everyone to see that inner working and how hopefully we're helping those types of folks get across and get to that large market that's out there.
Yeah, that's really great to hear. And I have to say, I'm really proud of the work that you guys have done here. You mentioned your location here at Capital Factory. And I can't tell you how many times I've had startups come to me or others on our team from our accelerator team and say, hey, I have this really cool technology. How do I get in touch with AFWERX? And it's literally like, just go walk downstairs. You can go and meet them right there. And so that's been really great to see. I think another point to add there is that, you mentioned working with industry partners. Our startups are now working with folks like CACI and MITRE and others to really get their products to market faster. And so it's been interesting for us here at Capital Factory to sit at the nexus where you have government partners, you have industry partners, and you have the startups, the innovators who are building really cool technology and want to get that out and get it to, get it on track to get a phase 2 and possibly a phase 3 SBIR. And so I just have to say that's been really, really great for us to see, and we really look forward to continuing working together and doing that as in the months and years that follow.
Well, Sean, thanks. Thanks for the words there. Like I said, we feel like we're just getting started. We've just established this new framework based off the lessons learned over the last couple of years of these other innovation efforts. We're building that organization right now. So, a couple of areas that we know we need improvement in the way we're reaching out, in the way we're explaining, what the processes are, in being able to deliver the speed that we want on the contracting actions, being able to create that connectivity with the warfighter right at the early stages, so that we're creating that market for these technologies. It's out there. We just being able to find that match between the technology and the need is something that I think have a path to accelerate even more. And then with the prime programs, being able to get that across quickly. So this is just the beginning of what I think is a very, very exciting time. And hopefully we are looking forward, have the opportunity to partner with all those fantastic innovators that are in the audience now, that are working in that Austin startup ecosystem.
Texas startup ecosystem.
Texas startup.
We're Texas-wide. And so on that note, what if I'm a startup and I want to get in touch with you guys, what's the best way for me to hand you my virtual business card?
Yeah, sure. So step one, you can go to afworks.af.mil. We've got a webpage there. We're going to be doing some, we've patched it together a little bit based on this new form. So we'll be doing some cleanup of that, but immediately you'll be able to see, hey, for industry, you'll be able to see those different opportunities out there. Certainly SBIRs. We've also done some recent challenge work. We've got some work happening in the space business on our space challenge. We've got an energy challenge that's been going on. A lot of different opportunities to reach out there across the challenges, across the contracting. And we've got a few other ideas on tools that will help us, again, accelerate that into the future. So excited to have folks go there. But yeah, afworks.af.mil. If you're interested in the Agility Prime specifically, agilityprime.com to take a look at those opportunities there. And you'll be able to reach the folks that hopefully can point you in the very right direction and connect you with the operators that really have a need for the fantastic things that you're all building.
Very awesome. Well, cool. Thank you so much again, Colonel Diller. Really appreciate your time today. And thank you for joining us.
John, thank you. It's great to be virtually back in the state of Texas, I guess.
There you go. Anytime. All right. So thank you again to Colonel Diller for his words and really great conversation around autonomy. And then again, also for CACI for being our sponsor for today's track and helping us learn more about how these startups can really get involved in everything that has to do with secure autonomy.